If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do. Before we begin, if you enjoy our content, please invite the like button to go on a 5-mile hike through the wilderness. Tell the like button you know a great shortcut, but instead lead them directly into a massive patch of poison ivy, steal their water bottle, and jog all the way back to your car. Now, let us get into today's story. To truly understand the absolute terror of this story, you first have to understand the psychology of a caver. Caving, or spelunking, is not a hobby for normal people. Humans are biologically programmed to fear absolute darkness, being trapped in tight spaces, and being buried alive. But for people who love exploring caves, those fears are replaced by an overwhelming obsession with discovery. They want to set foot in places where no human being has ever stood since the beginning of time. In the summer of 2019, two brothers named Mark and David were living in the state of West Virginia. Mark was 28 years old and David had just turned 31. They were not amateurs. They had been exploring wild, unmapped caves across the Appalachian Mountains for over 10 years. They owned thousands of dollars worth of professional gear, static ropes, heavy-duty climbing harnesses, specialized ascending devices, and highly durable waterproof headlamps. They knew how to measure oxygen levels in deep subterranean pits, and they knew exactly how to contort their bodies to slip through cracks in solid rock that most people would assume were far too small for a human to fit inside. In late July of that year, David was drinking a beer at a local dive bar when he struck up a conversation with an incredibly old man who used to work as a coal miner in the 1970s. The old man told David a local legend about a hidden limestone cave deep in the dense forests of the Blackwater region. According to the old miner, logging crews back in the 1920s used to complain about a massive, bottomless hole in the ground hidden between two giant oak trees. The loggers claimed that during the hottest days of summer, a freezing cold wind would blow directly out of this hole, smelling like ancient wet earth. The old man said the hole was entirely unmapped and totally unexplored because the locals believed the woods around it were cursed. For David and Mark, hearing about an unexplored cave system was like winning the lottery. They spent the next 3 weeks studying satellite topography maps, trying to pinpoint the exact location based on the old miner's vague directions. Finally, on the morning of August 14, 2019, they packed their heavy gear bags, loaded up their truck, and drove 3 hours into the deepest, most isolated part of the West Virginia wilderness. They parked their truck on the side of a dirt logging road and hiked for 4 hours straight into the dense, untamed forest. The weather was absolutely brutal. It was 95 degrees outside with 90% humidity. The air was thick and suffocating, but right around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark stopped walking and raised his hand. He could feel it. A steady, unnatural breeze brushing against his sweating face. It was freezing cold. They followed the cold air for another 200 yards until they found it. Hidden behind a massive wall of thick green briars, sitting perfectly flush with the forest floor, was a jagged black hole in the earth. It was roughly 6 feet wide and shaped like a jagged oval. Standing next to the hole, the temperature dropped instantly from 95 degrees down to 55 degrees. The cave was literally breathing cold air out into the forest. The brothers were ecstatic. They spent the next hour preparing their gear. They found a massive, deeply rooted oak tree near the entrance and tied off their heavy, static climbing ropes, double and triple checking their anchor knots. They strapped on their climbing harnesses, locked their carabiners, put on their heavy plastic helmets, and clicked on their incredibly bright primary headlamps. David went first. He stepped backward over the edge of the dark hole, letting his weight settle onto his harness, and began to rappel slowly down into the pitch-black abyss. Mark followed right behind him. The initial drop was entirely vertical. They rappelled straight down for 85 feet, their headlamps cutting through the absolute darkness, illuminating millions of years of water carving through solid limestone. When their boots finally touched the solid floor of the cave, they unclipped from their ropes and looked around. They were standing in an absolutely massive underground chamber. The ceiling was at least 40 feet high, covered in thousands of long, sharp stalactites that dripped freezing water onto the floor. The silence was deafening. There is no quiet on the surface of the earth that compares to the absolute crushing silence of a deep cave. For the first 4 hours, the exploration was a dream come true. The brothers mapped 3 entirely new chambers, taking photographs of massive, glittering crystal formations that had never been seen by human eyes. They were having the time of their lives. Around 6:30 in the evening, they reached the very back of the 3rd chamber. The massive room tapered down into a solid wall of gray limestone. But right at the bottom of the wall, where the rock met the mud floor, there was a horizontal crack. In the caving community, this type of passage is known as a belly crawl or a pancake squeeze. It was a horizontal tunnel, perfectly parallel to the ground, but it was incredibly low. The ceiling of the tunnel was only 14 inches above the floor. To get through it, a caver has to lie completely flat on their stomach, push their gear ahead of them, and drag themselves forward using only their toes and their elbows. David shined his extremely powerful flashlight into the tiny crack. The beam of light traveled for what looked like 100 feet before disappearing around a slight curve. "I feel a massive draft coming through this squeeze," David told his brother. "That means there is a huge room on the other side. I am going in." Mark agreed. David unbuckled his heavy gear bag, took off his plastic helmet so his head would fit, and pushed the bag and the helmet into the crack in the rock. Then, David lay flat on his stomach in the wet mud, turned his head sideways so his nose was resting against the dirt, and began to inch his way into the tiny, claustrophobic tunnel. Mark waited 5 minutes to give his brother some distance, then he took off his own helmet, laid down in the freezing mud, and crawled into the crack right behind him. Instantly, the psychological weight of the situation became terrifying. Mark had millions of tons of solid rock resting just half an inch above his back. If he took a deep breath, his chest would expand and his back would literally scrape against the stone ceiling. He had to take shallow, controlled breaths to avoid getting wedged. He could only see the soles of David's muddy boots slowly dragging forward in the beam of his handheld flashlight about 15 feet ahead of him. They crawled in agonizingly slow increments for almost 45 minutes. Every inch was a physical battle against the stone. The temperature inside the tight tunnel dropped significantly, making their fingers numb and clumsy. Then, the situation became significantly worse. The tunnel slowly began to taper. The 14-inch clearance slowly dropped to 12 inches. Then it dropped to barely 10 inches. Mark yelled up to his brother, his voice muffled and distorted by the tight walls of the rock. "David! It is getting incredibly tight back here. Are you sure this opens up?" David's voice echoed back, sounding strained and out of breath. "I think so. The draft is getting much stronger. Just give me another 50 feet. If it doesn't open up, we will back out." Backing out of a squeeze like this is a caver's worst nightmare. You cannot turn around. You have to drag yourself backward blindly, using only your toes to push while dragging your gear with your hands. It takes twice as long and is physically exhausting. Mark took a shallow breath, placed his cheek in the mud, and dragged himself forward another 10 feet. Suddenly, David's boots stopped moving. Mark waited a full minute, assuming David was just resting his muscles. But David did not move an inch. "David?" Mark called out into the dark. "Are you stuck?" There was a long, terrifying pause. When David finally answered, his voice did not sound strained from physical effort. He sounded absolutely terrified. "Mark," David whispered. His voice was trembling uncontrollably. "Turn off your flashlight." Mark frowned, his heart beginning to beat faster against the cold mud. What? Why? Just turn it off right now! Do it! David yelled in a panicked, hushed tone. Mark reached forward with a shaking hand and clicked the button on his flashlight. Instantly, the tunnel was plunged into a darkness so absolute and profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eyeballs. Okay, it is off, Mark whispered. What is wrong? Look past my boots, David whispered back. Look down the tunnel in front of me. Mark squeezed his eyes shut for a second, then opened them, letting his pupils adjust to the pitch-black environment. He stared past the dark outline of his brother's legs. Far down the tunnel, maybe 60 or 70 feet ahead of David, there was a light. It was not the bright, harsh, white LED light of a modern caving headlamp. It was a pale, sickeningly dull yellow glow, and it was slowly swaying back and forth in the dark. Mark's blood turned to ice. There was absolutely no way anyone else was down here. They had parked miles away from civilization, hiked through untamed wilderness, and rappelled down an unmarked pit. The idea of another person being hundreds of feet underground, trapped inside a 10-inch tunnel with a strange yellow light, defied all logic. Hello? David yelled out, his voice cracking with pure fear. Is someone there? We are stuck in the squeeze. The yellow light immediately stopped swaying. It just hovered perfectly still in the darkness. Then, very slowly, the yellow light began to move directly toward them. It was moving fast, impossibly fast for someone crawling through a 10-inch crack in solid bedrock. It was gliding forward with a smooth, silent speed that made absolutely no sense. Back up! David suddenly screamed, total hysteria taking over his voice. Mark, back up right now! Pull me back! Pull me back! Mark frantically clicked his flashlight back on. In the beam of his light, he saw David violently thrashing his legs, trying to push himself backward, but David was panicking. He was breathing heavily, his chest expanding wildly, which wedged his ribs securely against the ceiling and floor of the stone tunnel. He was completely, physically stuck. Mark dragged himself forward as fast as he could, ignoring the rock tearing the skin off his back. He reached out and grabbed both of David's heavy leather boots. I have you! Mark screamed. Exhale, blow all the air out of your lungs so you shrink down. David screamed in response, a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated horror. It is touching my helmet! Mark, it is touching my head! Pull me, please God, pull me! Mark planted the toes of his boots firmly against the jagged rock walls beside him, gripped his brother's boots with all his strength, and pulled backward with everything he had. For 1 second, David's body slid backward about 2 inches. But then, Mark felt a sudden, massive jolt of resistance from the other side. Something incredibly strong had grabbed David from the front. A literal, horrifying tug-of-war began deep inside the earth. Mark pulled backward with all his might, screaming as the muscles in his arms burned. But the force pulling David from the front was overwhelming, mechanical, and totally unnatural. It did not pull in jerks or spasms like a human would. It just pulled with a steady, unstoppable grinding force. Mark! David shrieked, his voice sounding muffled, as if something was physically covering his face. My arms are pinned! It is pulling me by the shoulders! Mark, don't let go! Do not let go! Mark was crying now, tears mixing with the thick mud on his face. He wrapped his arms entirely around his brother's calves, locking his fingers together, but the pulling force increased drastically. Mark was physically dragged forward through the mud by the sheer power of whatever had his brother. His helmet scraped violently against the ceiling. He was losing his grip. I can't hold on. Mark sobbed, his hands slipping against the wet leather of David's boots. Please. David screamed, a sound that Mark would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Suddenly, there was a sickening, terrifying sound of heavy fabric ripping, followed by a wet, heavy crunch of bone snapping. David was ripped out of Mark's hands with such extreme, violent velocity that David's heavy leather boots were physically stripped completely off his feet, left behind in Mark's desperate grip. David's body shot forward into the dark, sliding through the mud at an impossible speed. His screams echoed down the tight tunnel, fading incredibly fast as he was dragged deeper and deeper into the abyss until the screams abruptly stopped. Total, crushing silence returned to the cave. Mark lay there in the freezing mud, completely alone in the dark, clutching his brother's empty boots to his chest. He was hyperventilating, his mind entirely shattered by what had just happened. He stared forward into the black tunnel with his flashlight beam, expecting the pale yellow light to come rushing back to take him next. But nothing came. There was only the sound of water dripping onto the stone. Survival instinct finally overrode Mark's complete mental collapse. He knew if he stayed in that tight tunnel, he would die of hypothermia or shock. He had to begin the agonizing, slow process of backing out. For the next 2 grueling hours, Mark dragged himself backward, inch by tiny inch, crying hysterically in the pitch black. His elbows were rubbed completely raw, bleeding profusely into the mud. Every time he felt a cold draft hit his face, he thought the thing had returned to grab his ankles. When Mark finally spilled out backward out of the tight crack and fell onto the floor of the main chamber, he did not rest. He stood up, grabbed the main ascending rope, and climbed the 85-foot vertical shaft with a frantic, desperate energy fueled purely by adrenaline and terror. He broke the surface right as the sun was beginning to set over the West Virginia forest. He ran blindly through the woods for miles, tearing his clothes on briar patches until he collapsed onto the dirt logging road next to their truck. He grabbed his satellite phone and instantly dialed 911. Because 2 experienced cavers were involved in a life-or-death emergency, the state dispatched a massive, highly specialized cave rescue task force. By midnight, there were 50 trained professionals, paramedics, and state troopers surrounding the entrance to the cave. A team of 4 elite, extremely slender cave rescue divers descended into the hole. They brought high-powered lights, communication cables, and heavy-duty rock drills. Mark sat in the back of an ambulance on the surface, wrapped in 3 thermal blankets, staring blankly at the dark tree line, refusing to speak. The rescue team found the entrance to the belly crawl. The lead rescuer, a man who had been crawling through tight spaces for 25 years, squeezed himself into the crack. He followed Mark and David's deep tracks in the mud. He found the exact spot where the scuffle had taken place. He found Mark's drop flashlight, and he saw the deep, violent gouges in the mud where David had been dragged forward. The rescuer kept pushing forward, determined to find David. He dragged himself another 40 feet past the site of the attack. But then, the rescuer had to stop. He radioed the surface command post, his voice thick with absolute confusion and dread. The passage did not open up into a larger room. It did not connect to another tunnel. Exactly 40 feet past where David was violently pulled from his brother's grip, the solid limestone walls, the ceiling, and the floor of the tunnel all smoothly tapered down into a tiny, solid rock wedge. The rescuer measured the opening with his tape measure. The absolute widest part of the tunnel was exactly 3.5 inches across. It was solid, unbroken bedrock. There were no cracks, no hidden drop-offs, and no side tunnels. The cave simply ended in a microscopic slit in the stone. It is physically, medically, and scientifically impossible for a human skeleton, let alone a fully grown adult man wearing heavy winter clothing, to pass through a 3-inch gap in solid stone. Yet, wedged violently deep inside that tiny 3-inch crack, forced so far back into the stone that the rescuer could barely touch it with his fingertips, was David's shattered, bloody plastic caving helmet. David was gone. The official police report filed weeks later concluded that David had suffered a psychotic break from claustrophobia, squeezed himself entirely too far into a tight restriction, and perished deep in the cave where his body simply could not be recovered. The state welded a massive iron grate over the entrance of the cave, permanently sealing the hole shut forever. But Mark knows the absolute truth. He knows that his brother did not just get stuck. He knows that whatever lives down in the unmapped, pitch-black depths of the earth eventually gets hungry. Thank you so much for reading today's story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing as we post new, strange, dark, and mysterious stories multiple times a week. Until next time, stay safe.